Hello everyone, it's Daniel, Modern Identity Lead from Formula 5. In this video, I would like to talk about deployment architectures for Microsoft Entra External ID. I know that there is a lot of confusion around Entra External ID. There is a lot of confusion around whether it's like a feature in the standard Microsoft Entra ID tenant or whether it's like a separate instance of the tenant. So in this video, I would like to explain some of those concepts around Microsoft Entra External ID and also discuss deployment architectures. So let's start. Okay, so even before starting with Microsoft Entra ID and External ID, it's good to understand user relationship with organizations. So in a real-world scenarios, there are always some organizations that would like to manage their users, and also important fact is that those users can be different kinds of users. So it can be workforce users to be more precise. So those are the employees of specific organization. But obviously this organization can work with external users like business partners or customers. And those on the right side are called external users. And now obviously from the identity management perspective, there is this challenge, like how to manage identity for all those kinds of users and how to make sure that those users have a proper level of access to organizations' resources. So in this video, we are going to talk about Microsoft Entra ID and Microsoft Entra External ID. Because with those two services, obviously, we can secure access to our resources and applications that our organization owns. So let's talk first about this confusion around Entra ID and Entra External ID. So obviously, you probably know that in the standard workforce reality, there is Microsoft Entra ID tenant. Okay, so this is the tenant that we use to secure our corporate resources. Within this tenant, we have our employee accounts, and this tenant is basically used to secure access to different kinds of applications we use in our organization. However, on the other side, there is also Microsoft Entra External ID, which can be used actually to enable this access for external users like business partners, but also customers. So in this specific scenario, it's worth to understand that when I say Microsoft Entra External ID, actually I have on mind those two things you can see on the screen. So we can use Microsoft Entra External ID as a set of features available in the standard Microsoft Entra ID tenant, or we can also use Microsoft Entra External ID as a separate isolated tenant of Entra, which is obviously dedicated for customer accounts. So this is very important to remember, okay? And this generates confusion around Entra. So I want to clarify this. So Microsoft Entra External ID can be enabled in the workforce tenant, in the standard Entra ID tenant as a set of features to enable access for external users. But also, if we want to have full isolation, we can configure Microsoft Entra External ID as a separate tenant. And in this video, obviously, we will discuss more scenarios around when to actually use which approach. However, I wanted to make sure that we are on the same page about this configuration here. So now it's time to see it in practice actually, because I would like to show you the difference here, okay? So we will see those two tenants, like the standard Microsoft Entra ID tenant with Entra External ID features, and also we will see this separate tenant, which is called customer tenant, which is fully isolated tenant to keep customer accounts, which we will also discuss in this video. So let's switch to the Entra Admin Center now. So here is Microsoft Entra Admin Center, and I have two tabs actually here. Here is my workforce tenant, so standard Microsoft Entra ID tenant. And in another tab, you can see that I have my isolated Entra External ID tenant for customers. So let's start with standard workforce tenant, like the tenant that you use for your organization. So with this workforce standard Entra ID tenant, I can protect access to the resources my organization uses. Like for instance, with this Entra ID tenant, I can protect access to the Azure portal and Azure resources that my organization uses. Also, I can protect access to SaaS applications like Salesforce or Bamboo HR. And now the thing is that to invite external users to collaborate with my organization, I can use B2B feature. So obviously, I have to invite this external user as a guest to my tenant. And now I think the confusion is that in the standard Microsoft Entra ID tenant, you can invite guest users using B2B feature, but also there is this section called external identities. So I would like to explain this in this video. So let me start with standard B2B invitation feature available in Entra ID to make sure that we understand what's going on here when it comes to external identities. So before I will move forward with external identities, let me go to all the users. And from there, as you can see, I can either create new user in my tenant or I can select invite external user. Let me click this one. So this thing here is standard B2B invitation flow. So with this flow, I can invite the user to my workforce tenant, Microsoft Entra ID standard tenant. And obviously, if you use Microsoft Entra ID governance, you have some additional features to invite guests to your Entra ID tenant, to manage their life cycle and access to different kinds of resources. So entitlement management is also in place. But here, I just want to focus on the basics so you can understand what's going on when it comes to Entra External ID features. So this is standard B2B invitation flow. I can provide the email of the user that I will invite. I can provide display name here. As you can see, I can select send invite message. So then email will be sent to this person. And under properties, I can provide additional information about the user. Assignments. So here I can, assign specific group in Entra, assign specific role in Entra for this user, add this user to specific group, like security group. And then I can click review and invite, and then I can invite this user to my tenant. And this user will be invited as guest user to my tenant. Okay, nothing special. And here it's just basic B2B invitation flow. However, let me close that actually. And let me open external identities tab now. So now you can ask, okay, Daniel, so you mentioned that you can invite guest user to the tenant, and also there is external identities tab. So probably you can also use this feature to invite external people to the workforce tenant, which is Microsoft Entra ID tenant, which is correct. But what is the difference actually? The difference is that using this standard B2B invitation feature, you can add guest accounts to your tenant and you can grant access to your corporate resources and applications like Microsoft Teams, like SharePoint sites, Azure portal, those kinds of resources, or Salesforce, Bamboo HR, so those kinds of SaaS applications. So this is about the standard B2B invitation flow. So you can grant access to those guest accounts to access specific applications that are used within your organization. However, using external identities feature, you can go beyond standard B2B feature and you can provide access to the applications that are developed by your organization. And this is very important to understand this. So external identities feature can be used to enable access for external users to the applications that your organization built. Okay, like line of business applications that your organization created, developed. So you cannot use external identities feature and user flows here, which I will explain in a minute. You cannot use this flow to actually grant access to applications like Salesforce, Teams, or SharePoint. Okay, that's very important to remember. So now you can ask, okay, Daniel, so what is the purpose of having external identities here? The thing is that your organization actually can have applications that should be used and are used by external users, like those partners or customers. And then the thing is that with external identities here, you can secure access to those external applications, and you can enable something what is called self-service signup. Okay? So with self-service signup, you can configure user flows. So external users can, sign up, and they can go through the registration flow. They will be also created as guest accounts in your organization, but then they will gain access to those applications that your organization develop. So for instance, it can be some custom application developed using Blazor, and this is web application. It's external application that you would like to provide to your business partners. So in this case, or customers, and those people will be able to go through the registration flow. So here, if I go to external collaboration settings, you will notice that here under external, where was it? Apologize, it was here. Yeah, enable guest self-service sign up via user flows. If I enable this, it means that those external users will be able to register themselves. They will have accounts, guest accounts created in my workforce tenant, and they will have access to those applications that my organization developed and created. And now moving forward, if I enable this, I can configure user flows here. So user flows are actually those login and registration pages that you can create actually, okay? So you can, for instance, enable login with Facebook or login with Google. And you can also enable this registration flow for the users. So they will have to provide their email, then the OTP code will be sent to this email, they have to confirm this email, and then they will land in your application. So that's why you can use user flows only with your developed applications, because you have to configure them actually to use this feature. So if you want to secure applications that are developed by your organization, user flows is the way to go. If you want to enable self-service sign up for those users, external users, user flows is the way to go. And this is the feature actually under external identities tab in the workforce tenant, as you can see. So it means that with external identities features and user flows, you will be able to secure access to your external applications. But still, those users that will sign up, register, will land in your workforce tenant. That's very important, okay? So, having said that, obviously we will discuss this more deeper in the presentation that I prepared, but this is about external identities feature in the corporate workforce Entra ID tenant. And obviously here, as you can see under all identity providers, as I mentioned, I can configure additional identity providers like Microsoft, like Google, like Facebook. What you can also achieve with external identities, you can add API connectors. So for instance, if you need to call external service like API during the registration process, you can also achieve this with API connector. So actually, with external identities feature in the workforce tenant, you can secure your external applications your organization develop in the modern way. Okay, so that's very important to mention. Okay, perfect. So now, once we understand this about the workforce tenant, now we have to discuss what's going on with this customer tenant. So Microsoft Entra External ID tenant. So the thing is that, as you remember, I mentioned in my video that you can either use external identities in your corporate Entra ID tenant, workforce tenant, or you can create separate isolated tenant for customers. Okay? So this is very important. So this is the Microsoft Entra External ID tenant for customers. So all those users that will use external applications owned by my organization, they will be able to create their accounts, register, log in with different kinds of identity providers like Google and Facebook, and their accounts will land in this external tenant. So this tenant is isolated from the workforce tenant, so those customer accounts will not land in this workforce tenant, they will land in this separate Entra External ID tenant. And now moving forward, you can ask, okay, so how I can potentially create those tenants? So under Overview tab in the workforce tenant, you can see that here I have Manage Tenants tab, okay? And under this tenant, what I can do actually, I can obviously manage all my current tenants, but I can create new tenant. When I will click Create button, this can be also confusing here, so let me explain that. I can select Workforce tenant and External tenant. As you remember, I mentioned that we have those two options: Workforce tenant for our organization, External tenant, fully isolated, Entra External ID tenant for customer accounts. And now we can see that from there, I can create only External tenant, and Workforce tenant is grayed out. Why? Because the thing is that Microsoft changed the policy. So right now you can only create workforce tenants if you are paid customer. So for instance, if you create your account in the Azure cloud, then Entra ID tenant will be created for you automatically. You will have billing configured, and then you can create workforce tenant. So it's not possible anymore to just create workforce tenants for free without actually being paid customer of Microsoft. But still, it's possible to create workforce tenants. As I mentioned, you can sign up for free for Azure, let's say, and workforce tenant will be created for you automatically. So you will have the possibility to provide the name and the region for this tenant. And also you can create external tenant. So this will be isolated, separate Microsoft Entra external tenant. And as you can see, this will be used for external facing applications used by customers and business customers. Okay, so if I click continue here, I will be able to create such new tenant. This will be my external tenant. And once it's created, actually, I will have access to this tenant in the Entra Admin Center. And as you can see, this is my separate tenant. This is not my workforce tenant. And now the thing is that when I scroll down and I open Identity, I still have this tab called External Identities. And from there, I can configure again user flows. I can configure custom authentication extensions. So for instance, if I need to call external API during the sign up process or login process, I will be able to do this. I can also set up branding for the user flows, add additional identity providers. So actually, when I click user flows, you can see that here I have configured user flow for my external application. And this is actually the place where I can manage all those user flows, configurations, identity providers. But still, this is isolated tenant. So everyone who will create account in this tenant will land in this tenant, not in the workforce tenant. Perfect. So now, once we understand the difference, it's time to move forward and actually discuss a little bit more about the Microsoft Entra External ID deployment architectures. So let me get back to presentation. Okay, so moving forward, before we decide how to deploy Microsoft Entra External ID, it's important to define personas in Microsoft Entra world, okay? So those are the typical personas in the Entra world. Workforce, so those are full-time employees, like those employee accounts in Microsoft Entra ID, okay? So those are accounts for employees of our organization. Business partners, example, vendors working with your organization. So those are business partners that you can invite to your tenant using B2B feature that I showed you, okay? So this will be like a standard guest account in your workforce tenant. Consumers or customers, example, individuals and customers, okay? So consumers, those will be probably like a customers that will be accessing external facing applications. And in general, external users. These can be business partners or consumers, okay? So typically we call them external users. And now the question is how to collaborate with these external users. And the answer is choose the proper deployment architecture for external identities. So now let's explain some of those deployment architecture possibilities. So the first one is workforce and collaboration oriented architecture. So in this architecture, we have Microsoft Entra ID workforce tenant, the standard Entra ID tenant, which can have ID governance features enabled, and it has external ID features enabled. So those were the features I showed you. So in workforce tenant, actually, I can configure external ID. So the user flows to secure the applications my organization develop. And now we can provide access to external users using external ID features in our workforce tenant. And also, obviously, we can provide access to all the applications, all the resources that our organization owns for workforce users. So for the employees of our organization. So on the right side, we have all those different kinds of applications. And now, obviously, using Microsoft Entra ID governance, we have the possibility to control how this access will be granted to those applications and resources. So for instance, with ID governance and entitled management, we can control how those external users will be accessing those applications that are owned by our organization. And also moving forward, we can also control the life cycle for those external users with ID governance. So for instance, if they don't need the access anymore to those applications, they can be, for instance, removed automatically from Microsoft Entra ID workforce tenant. Okay, so in this specific workforce and collaboration oriented architecture, the thing is that we have workforce tenant, standard Microsoft Entra ID tenant, where we can leverage B2B invitations for guest users, and also we can enable external ID to secure those applications that are actually developed by our organization, and we can provide access to external users to those applications. Another deployment architecture is isolated access for external users. Okay, so this is different kind of deployment architecture. So let's explain it now. So in this isolated access for external users deployment architecture, again, we have our Microsoft Entra ID workforce tenant, tenant for internal workforce users only. Okay, only for employee accounts within our organization. So we have our workforce users. Their accounts are stored in the standard workforce Entra ID tenant. And obviously those applications can access all those different kinds of applications owned by our organization. Okay, those can be applications developed by our organization. Those can be SaaS applications like Salesforce or, for instance, Bamboo HR. Those can be applications like Microsoft Teams or SharePoint sites. And now there is this boundary, this separation, okay? And underneath, we have external users, those partners and consumers, as you remember I mentioned before. And for those users, we don't want to keep their accounts actually in our workforce standard Entra ID tenant. We want to keep them in a separate tenant. So what we do, we create another Microsoft Entra ID workforce tenant, but at this time, this will be tenant for external users, partners and consumers. And the thing is that both of those tenants that you can see on this slide, those are workforce tenants, not customer tenants or consumer tenants that you saw in the Entra Admin Center I presented. We still talk about Microsoft Entra ID, standard workforce tenant here. So we create this separate tenant where we can utilize features like ID governance and external ID. And we can provide access to those applications that are secured by this separate workforce tenant. And with this deployment architecture, we have this clear separation between our workforce tenant and actually the separate workforce tenant that is used for partners and consumers. So in this specific scenario, we can grant access to specific applications owned by our organization to workforce users, and those users will be stored in one Entra ID tenant, workforce tenant. And if we have some external applications that we would like to provide access to those external users like partners and consumers, those applications will be secured with this separate Entra ID tenant, which is also workforce tenant. And actually in this separate tenant, we can configure ID governance. So again, we can utilize entitlement management. We can grant access to specific resources. We can manage guest users. We can use user flows in the external ID to also enable self-service sign up for those external users. And there is this full isolation. So there is not mix of accounts in one tenant. We have two separate workforce tenants. The third architecture, which is also a typical architecture for external users, is consumer-oriented architecture. So in this architecture, we actually utilize Microsoft Entra ID customer/external tenant. So tenant for customers. So in this specific scenario, as you remember what I showed you in the Entra Admin Center, we have separate tenant, which is called Microsoft Entra External ID tenant. It's tenant and that is created dedicatedly to handle and store customer accounts. It's separate tenant from the workforce tenant, and within this tenant we can configure all the customer facing applications. We can configure also connections with our APIs using custom authentication extensions. We can leverage native authentication API, which is used for native applications like iOS or Android, to build those crafted to perfection sign up and login flows. And all those features are stored in this separate tenant. So on the left side, you can see that we have customers, so customer users, and those users can register and then can sign in and then start using those external applications, which we see on the right side. So this is fully isolated tenant. It's called Microsoft Entra External ID tenant or customer tenant. And with this tenant, you can actually build customer identity and access management solution. So SIAM solution. So with this tenant, you will be able to actually use all the modern protocols like OpenID Connect and OAuth, modern standards for authentication, authorization. You will be able to utilize native authentication API, which I mentioned before, to craft those user flows to perfection in the mobile applications. You will be able to integrate user flows with external APIs, to grab some data from external sources, to store some information in the separate sources or databases. So it's really powerful. And if you have the need for such architecture, definitely you should use separate tenant, which is Microsoft Entra External ID tenant. And obviously you can ask, hey, is there a possibility to actually mix those architectures? And the answer is yes, you can mix them. So let me put some examples here. So you can have workforce and collaboration oriented architecture, which I mentioned at the beginning. So this architecture here, okay? Let me get back to this. So we can have this architecture. So workforce and collaboration oriented architecture. We have our Entra ID workforce tenant, standard Entra ID tenant, where we have our applications. We have ID governance enabled. We have external ID enabled. And this tenant is used with workforce users and also external users like business partners. But your organization can decide, hey, we want to have this separation also for customer-facing applications, for external applications that are only used by external users. So in this case, you can combine this architecture actually with the architecture I mentioned before. So consumer-oriented architecture. So with this one. So in the end, you actually ending up with workforce and collaboration-oriented architecture with your workforce Entra ID tenant, and you have separate tenant, isolated tenant, which also enables access for business partners and customers. Okay, and this tenant is used also for this purpose. And obviously, the second thing is we have workforce and collaboration-oriented architecture, and we have consumer-oriented architecture. So in this case, let me explain. So I mentioned that we can mix those architectures. So actually, when you have workforce and collaboration oriented architecture, you use your Entra ID tenant, workforce tenant. And if you have the need to fully isolate external applications, consumer applications, then you use consumer oriented architecture and Microsoft Entra External ID. However, if you have a situation where you need to actually isolate access for business partners, but you want to use standard Entra ID workforce tenant, then you can use workforce and collaboration oriented architecture and isolated access for business partners. So actually you can mix up this architecture I mentioned at the beginning, so this one, with isolated access for external users. Okay, so in this case you will have actually such architecture where you have your workforce tenant, you have your external ID, and you have your external other tenant, also workforce tenant for those external users. So you can mix them, but typically architectures that you will see is workforce and collaboration oriented architecture. So this one, where you can internally enable external ID and you can use ID governance features. You can have isolated access for external users. So you have 2 workforce tenants with Entra. So this architecture. And also if you have customer facing applications and solutions, you want to use consumer oriented architecture with fully isolated Microsoft Entra External ID tenant. Okay, perfect. So now let me move forward. And in this specific scenario, I want to talk a little bit more about mixed architectures example. So workforce and collaboration oriented architecture and consumer oriented architecture, because I think that this architecture will be typically used when you have a need to separate your workforce accounts or employee accounts from the customer accounts, which are actually used with your customer facing applications. So in such mixed architecture, as I mentioned before, you have your Microsoft Entra ID workforce tenant with ID governance features enabled. You can also enable external ID there. And you can provide access to your obviously workforce users like employees and partners, external users. You can use B2B feature to just invite external users as guest users to your tenant. You can use ID governance for that and entitlement management, and then enable, like also managing the life cycle of those external users. As I mentioned before, if there is no need for those external users to have access to your corporate resources anymore, they can be automatically deleted, removed from your tenant with ID governance. But the thing is that you have your workforce tenant that is shared with employee accounts and partner accounts. But also on the other side, your organization can have a need to secure external facing applications. So let's say that your application is also developing some applications and solutions that will be used by external users like customers, okay? And in this specific scenario, obviously you don't want your customer accounts to be created in your workforce tenant actually. So for that, you can create separate Microsoft Entra External ID tenant, so customer tenant, and in this tenant, all the customer accounts will be created. And in this tenant, you can register your customer facing applications, APIs, and then this tenant will be purely used to secure external resources for your customers. So this is the typical architecture you will see where there is a need to secure customer facing applications and also corporate resources. So on the left side, we have our workforce tenant, Entra ID tenant, where you can potentially enable external ID features like user flows I mentioned. But if you want to have this full isolation for user accounts, you can create Microsoft Entra External ID tenant or a customer tenant. And with this tenant, you will gain additional features to build SIAM solutions, so customer identity and access management solutions. So as I mentioned, in the customer tenant, you can use native authentication API. You can, enable custom branding for your login and registration pages. You can also enable custom domain there. So there are many different kinds of features that you can utilize to actually create those modern authentication scenarios for your customers. Okay, perfect. So now it's time to see it in action. The last thing I would like to show you is how to use workforce tenant and what is the difference when accessing resources, and actually how to use a customer tenant to secure access to external resources, customer facing applications to be more precise. So let's see it in action. Okay, so as I mentioned, we have two tenants, workforce tenant and Microsoft Entra External ID tenant. So the one that we use to secure customer-facing applications. Let's start with the workforce tenant. As I mentioned, workforce tenant is used to secure access to our corporate resources. As you can see, this is my workforce tenant called Formula 5 Dev. And now what I can do with this tenant, I can, for instance, secure access to my Azure subscriptions. So now when I open Azure portal, you can see that here I have access to Azure portal, Formula5.dev, Entra ID tenant is used. And from there, I can create Azure resources and I have access to my Azure subscriptions. An important thing is that right now, what I can do, if there is any need that I have to add an external partner or vendor to this Azure subscription, because let's say that my organization needs help with some cloud development, I can go to this workforce tenant and I can invite actually external user to this tenant using B2B feature. Or obviously, if I use Microsoft Entra ID governance, I can leverage entitlement management and then also add those external users, external partners to my workforce tenant, so they will also gain access to the Azure portal. However, on the other side, let's say that my organization has some applications that are applications developed for customers. So in this case, I don't want to keep those customer accounts in my workforce tenant. So in this case, I can leverage Microsoft Entra External ID tenant. So this separate tenant I mentioned, tenant for consumer applications and solutions. And in this tenant, I can configure external user flows. So here I have user flows, as you can see. I can configure them here. This video obviously will not explain all the configuration of the user flows, but I just want to explain what's going on here. So here I have sign up, sign in flow. So let me open that really quickly. And here, as you can see, users will be able to sign in with email and password. Also, I want to collect some additional attributes during the sign up here. So I'm collecting user attributes during the sign up, like display name, given name, privacy policy, username. And obviously under applications, I have my applications that my organization developed. So in this case, when I click applications, you can see here that I have my Formula Healthcare application assigned here, because this application will be used with this user flow. So if I open Formula Healthcare application, which is custom application developed by my organization, as you remember, I mentioned that Microsoft Entra External ID can be used with applications that our organization develop only. So if you want to provide access to SharePoint on Microsoft Teams, you have to either use B2B feature or ID governance with entitlement management. So let me switch here. So this is Formula Healthcare demo portal. This is a customer facing application developed by my organization. And as you can see, this is the page provided by Microsoft Entra External ID tenant by specific user flow I created here. So sign up, sign in, user flow. So now, once I configure my application to be used with this Entra External ID tenant, I can either create account using create one here, but also if I already have an account, I can provide my email here like this, and I can provide my password like this, and I can sign in, okay? Once I'm authenticated, as you can see, I land in Formula Healthcare demo portal. And as you probably noticed, the branding is aligned. So on the login page, I had this custom background. There was a logo of Formula 5. So now I have access to this customer facing application, which is Formula Health demo portal. I can see my patient ID. From there, I can also click get prescription. I can access my prescriptions. I can generate medical report here. So in the end, I have access to this specific external application. And this is where Microsoft Entra External ID tenant can really help you to manage and secure those external applications and to isolate customer accounts. That's it what I've prepared for this video. I hope you found it interesting and helpful. If you still have any questions, do not hesitate to contact me directly using my email address currently displayed on the screen. Additionally, if you feel that your organization needs additional help with Entra deployments for internal users and external users, you can also contact me directly so our Formula 5 team can help you. Thank you so much for watching and see you in the next videos.